The two most powerful city-states in ancient Greece were Athens and Sparta. Despite both being essentially Greek, they were very different places, and often at war with each other. Athens was mostly a democracy, where all citizens could vote in the assembly. To be a citizen, you had to be a male, own property, and be born in Athens. Women, slaves, foreigners and children were not citizens, and had very few rights. In Athens, usually, only the sons of rich Athenian families would have a proper education. They started learning at the age of 7. They studied things like reading, grammar, poetry, history, maths and music. If they planned to work in the government, they might also learn public speaking. From the age of 18 to 20, Athenian males would join the army, to learn how to defend Athens during wars. Athens was famous for having a strong navy, due to being on the coast, and the invention of the trireme, a ship with 3 rows of oars, which made them faster and more maneuverable than other ships. Athenian girls didn't get to go to school. Instead, they might be taught at home by another female, and would learn skills to help them become good mothers and wives. Rich women weren't allowed to leave the house without a man joining them, whereas poor women would be allowed out to go to the marketplace, as they wouldn't have slaves or servants to do the shopping for them. Sparta was an oligarchy. A group of older men would make decisions that affected the city, while there were usually 2 kings who were in charge of the Spartan army. There were 3 groups of people in Sparta: the Spartiatae, the Perioikoi and the Helots. A Spartiate was a full citizen of Sparta, male or female. They weren't allowed to work as their role was to train to defend the city. A Perioikos was free, but was not a full citizen. They were mostly responsible for all manufacturing and trading in Sparta. Finally, a Helot was a slave. They were mostly used for farming the land, and belonged to all of Sparta, not to individuals, like in other city-states. In Sparta, when a child was born, soldiers would come to inspect it. If it looked weak, it would be killed, or might become a helot. Both boys and girls went to a military school at the age of 7. They left home, and moved into an army barracks. This became their new family. The boys spent their days exercising and learning to fight. They were underfed, and encouraged to steal, so that they would become tough soldiers. The girls would run, wrestle and play sports, and receive a small amount of military training. Women had more rights in Sparta than in other city-states. They could own property and ran the household while the men were at war. They were also expected to defend Sparta while the men were away, as unlike other city-states, Sparta had no protective walls. Homer was a poet from the 9th or 8th century BCE. He is considered one of ancient Greece's greatest poets. However, there are some historians who don't think he ever existed. Only 2 of his tales survive today, the Iliad and the Odyssey, though there are many ancient texts that say he wrote other poems. One of the topics that was compulsory for boys in Athenian schools was to study Homer, so we are going to look at the Odyssey. The main character is called Odysseus, who was the king of an island called Ithaca. He was involved in the Trojan War. It was his idea to use the wooden horse to trick the Trojans. The Odyssey is about his journey home after the war. Unfortunately, the Greeks had upset the gods, and so as punishment, the journey took many years and there were many dangers along the way. After Odysseus and his crew left Troy, his ships were blown off course. Over the next few years, all of his crew were killed off, until only Odysseus remained, trapped on the island of a nymph called Calypso. Calypso wanted to marry Odysseus, but he wanted to return home to his wife and son. Eventually, the other gods convinced Calypso to let him go, and she let him leave on a raft. However, Poseidon was still angry with Odysseus and destroyed the raft. He managed to swim to land and found himself in the land of the Phaeacians, who agreed to help him get home. Meanwhile, because Odysseus had been gone for 20 years, due to the war and his journey, His wife had many men that wanted to marry her and become the new king. However, she believed that Odysseus was still alive, and her son asked Zeus for help to get rid of the men bothering her. The son then decided to try and find out about his father. He spoke to several other kings who were involved in the Trojan War and found out about Odysseus being trapped by Calypso. Odysseus was given a banquet by the king of the Phaeacians, and during the meal he tells the story of what happened after he left Troy. They first attacked a city, but lost many men. They then visited a group called the Lotus Eaters. Some of his crew ate a strange plant, and it made them never want to leave. However, Odysseus managed to rescue them. Next, they encountered a cyclops called Polyphemus. He trapped them in his cave so that he could eat them. While trying to convince the cyclops not to eat them, Odysseus says his name is Nobody. While Polyphemus slept, he sharpened a big piece of wood, and blinded Polyphemus. Polyphemus asked for help from the other cyclops. However, when they asked who hurt him, he replied, "Nobody," so they left. Polyphemus kept sheep in his cave, and every day he would let them out to eat. So, Odysseus and his men tied themselves to the bottom of some sheep. When the sheep left the cave, Polyphemus tried to find the men by touch because he couldn't see, but could only feel his sheep, so they escaped. Poseidon was angry, because Polyphemus was his son, and so he stopped any wind from helping Odysseus' ships. All but one of the boats ended up sinking. They met Aeolus next, who was keeper of the winds. He gave them a bag of wind to help them get home. However, when they were nearly home, one of Odysseus' men opened the bag, thinking it was treasure, and blew him off course again. They ended up near an island of man-eating giants who wanted to eat the crew, and threw huge rocks at the ships, sinking some and eating the men. The survivors landed on the island of a witch called Circe. She transformed most of Odysseus' men into pigs. With help from Hermes, Odysseus was protected and stole Circe's magic wand, and wouldn't give it back unless she changed his men back to humans. She did this and even told Odysseus how to get home. They traveled to a land of the dead, and one of their fellow soldiers who died in Troy advised them on how to get home. They had to sail past the sirens, creatures who had a beautiful song which made men crash their ships so they could eat them. Odysseus had his men plug their ears with wax, but made them tie him to the mast of the ship so he could listen to the songs. Next, they came upon Charybdis, a giant whirlpool, which they managed to sail around. This was followed by trying to get past the creature Scylla, who had many mouths which grabbed some of his men and ate them. Finally, they landed on an island known as the Island of the Sun. They had been warned not to eat any of the cows on this island because they belonged to the gods. However, some of his men killed a few of the cows. When they tried to leave the island, Zeus sent a thunderbolt that destroyed the ship, and only Odysseus survived, landing on the island of Calypso. Having heard the story, the Phaeacian king ordered his men to take Odysseus home. When he reached Ithaca, Athena then helped him come up with a way to deal with all the men that wanted to marry his wife, mostly through disguises and trickery. Eventually, Odysseus, his son and his wife were reunited.